Good morning. Welcome back to Ribbon Candy Hooking. Little delay. Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Welcome back. Let's see. Beverly, good morning. Sue's good morning in beautiful Kansas. We're getting beautiful weather here in Connecticut, too. It's just a gorgeous day. It started out a little gray and gloomy, but it's looking gorgeous now. It's looking like a summer day. Cynthia, hello. Kirsten, hello. Cloudy and looking a lot like Washington State. I might clear up for you too in Vermont, Kirsten. I hope so. Sheila, good morning in Benton City, Washington. Robin, good morning. How are you? April, good morning. Cindy, good morning. And Chrissy. All right. Oh shoot, I hit something. Well, I'm not going to mess with it, but good morning, everybody. I know my mom's not tuning in today because she has her spirituality class with her buddies, her best art buddies, and they do that like once a month, so that'll be nice. Well, I hope you're having a good morning. A couple of things I wanted to mention that are worth mentioning. I am going to run both of the Magdalena classes Wednesday, which is tomorrow night, and again on Sunday, because after the show yesterday, a bunch of people signed up for it on both days. So Sunday is worth running. I think there's 4 people in that class, so that will be a super fun night for us. And of course, tomorrow night, Wednesday night, will be the first one. I'll put on a little reminder post, and I'll probably post that song called Lollipop Tree because Magdalena is just iconically attached and associated with the lollipop tree, her own creation. So that will be super fun. I'm looking forward to that. I've got my camera in a different place now, so I'm looking at you here and reading notes over here. But yeah, so that will be great. Getting a lot of stuff out. The wool came. I actually ordered more just to be on top of things because I went through so much. Oh, look at that. I just broke my glasses. Perfect, right? I'll change to the close-up ones. So, yesterday we were talking about Maine, and we were kind of concluding on the Maine Mission rugs, and I thought it was just such a good segment. It was super inspirational. I love these stories of people who make a really big difference, particularly in the rug hooking world. Of course, that's where my huge interest is. But I loved that story, and I concluded it for the moment. But we are going to take out this book that I showed you sort of a teaser of yesterday, Rug Hooking in Maine, 1838 to 1940 by Mildred Cole Peladeau. And this really is, I haven't read all of it yet, but I mean, I've read a lot of it. This really is one of the great definitive books on rug hooking. It is so good. I'm going to have to reach for, where is it? Oh, I'm going to have to reach for something later. But I figured I'd start with the beginning because in this book, she will come to the Maine Mission rugs. And she comes to so many of the things that we talked about. Table of contents is like Walterborough Rugs, Acadian Rugs, Mini Light, that's a name we haven't had yet on Coffee Time, Edward Sands Frost, American Rug Pattern Company, Sabatos Rugs, Cranberry Island Rugs, Maine Mission Rugs, Marguerite Zorak Rugs. We did a long segment on her, a whole week long, if you remember, as part of the series. I think it was in the fall, Fine Artists Who Also Hooked. And that was such a cool crossover, I thought, because people who are fine artists to begin with are really hooking to hang on the wall, right? They're not hooking rugs and things. They're hooking art for the wall, like proper textile art. And it was so neat to see people in the late 19th, early 20th century who had approached rug hooking as a fine art. It's so different. We always look at the chronology of rug hooking, in terms of events. And movements and missions and things like that, like a proper timeline. But it's also interesting to look at rug hooking in terms of ideas. That will be part of what I talk about tomorrow in the Magdalena class, because there are moments in hooking in the whole timeline that things happened that are important that aren't really part of the timeline. For example, with Magdalena, she really is the first person who is going to do like a scatter pattern as a composition. All those animals scattered amongst lollipop trees, upside down, right side up, backwards, forwards, front, back. She's really the first person who's going to do that. And it sounds like such a silly thing and such a small thing, but it's actually a huge thing in terms of the arc. Because we go from scrolls and medallions and sometimes people striking out and making a little house, making their own house, making a family pet. But at that point, we didn't have anybody doing scatter patterns. That was completely new and different. It's so exciting to look and see and think about these things in context. We don't need, there could be someone else who was the first before that we haven't, dated the rug. But in terms of being prolific and having a certain style, that really is part of the timeline. All of the things in this book are part of the timeline, and they all have to do with Maine. And it is just remarkable looking at a book like this to sort of ponder on how much rug hooking history happened in Maine. So much of it we don't know and we can't pin down, and certainly years, but people and players and this kind of thing we can pin down, and much of it is Maine. So this book is so important. It's so important that this book exists because it touches on everything that we talk about, but then it narrowly specializes in events and people in Maine. And it still seems endless just looking at that one state. So in the introduction, so this will be Mildred. This is her introduction that I'm going to read parts of. She says, and I think this is so sweet. When you read an introduction to a book, particularly a nonfiction book, you immediately get a tone for the person and the kind of storytelling that they do, the kind of energy, the kind of approach. It's so important to read the introduction because it's easy to flip forward knowing that that's not the meat and potatoes of the thing, but you do get such a good feel for the motivation of the person in choosing to spend the time writing the book, and also a feel for their personality, and you're able to picture the person a lot better. So she begins her very first words of this book by saying, "I can remember as a small child interrupting play to dash into the house shouting, 'Ragman's coming, Ragman's coming.' Slowly emerging over the brow of the hill," beautifully written, "was a horse and a wagon. The age of mechanized travel had arrived, but some traditions lingered. The driver endlessly chanting, 'Rags to bags, rags to bags,' in an attempt to solicit old rags from the neighborhood homes. Mother scurried into the shed, gathering up a pile of rags that had been accumulating. While I raced out to the stop, the ragman, to stop the ragman, she dragged forth her treasure. The ragman weighed the rags and paid my mother a paltry sum, which I believe was about a penny a pound. I did not know then that the rags were being gathered to use in making paper, thus explaining the ragman's chant, 'Rags to bags,' meaning paper bags. What a wondrous thing." I love how she so often in this book uses the phrase, "what a wondrous thing." And I love that introduction because I also remember, my mom's not on today, but I remember her saying that when she was growing up in Warren, Rhode Island, so this would be like the early 50s, sorry, Mom, not that that's old at all, but she also remembers the ragman shouting like, "Get your rags," or "Take out your rags," or something like that. Not rags to bags, but she remembered him well. And again, obviously there's cars and everything at that point, but some traditions linger. So then she goes on to say, "Many people later learned of the rugs that grew out of such rags under the influence of craftspeople who refused to give up their rags to the ragman. What a wondrous thing," she says again. It's so sweet. And she says, "Long intrigued by Maine's extremely rich history in the field of rug hooking, I have been appalled at how little that heritage has been appreciated and how sparsely it has been preserved within the state. Rug hooking is Maine's premier handicraft, more prolific even than more prolific than quilt making. Many believe it originated in the state, and traditions suggest that the craft started in Maine or Nova Scotia." I think this is a very solid point she's making. It is hard, even when you're in Maine, to find rugs. There's no sort of centralized history of rug making. She goes on to say, and this is such a good point, and it's not taking anything away from the history, the heritage, and the importance of quilts in early America and even today, but she makes the point that museums, just universally, are brimming with quilts and samplers, and obviously rightfully so. However, early quilts to a large extent are not original forms of folk art. The vast majority show excellent craftsmanship in being put together, but they are someone else's design. They are beautiful, but most of them follow a standard pattern devised by one person who deserves the single honor of being the true folk artist. For example, there is the drunkard's path, the Star of Bethlehem, the pine tree, the schoolhouse, the log cabin, the double wedding ring. Endless quilt blocks, right? Endless. I know so many of you are quilters, and they are all enchanting, but they are not original designs. There are exceptions, of course, like Crazy Quilts, of course, are completely original. Baltimore album quilts are often completely original blocks. But for the most part, when you find a quilt, no matter how beautiful it is not an original design. Whereas this early sort of period, 19th century rug making, particularly for people in rural areas, these are original designs. For the most part, people are drawing original designs. Early rugs, on the other hand, I'm reading again, are true examples of folk art, each one individually made, usually by some isolated rural housewife who had no access to pre-designed patterns. She sat in front of the fireplace with a piece of charcoal and let her imagination dictate the character of her rug as she sketched out her design on a piece of linen or a burlap bag. What a wondrous thing. Oh, I just love that she says that. It's so cheerful and uplifting. So I think that is a very solid point that she's making. It's a point, because I love quilts and rugs, it's a point that I never thought about. How many original rug patterns from particularly the early and mid 19th century there are, as opposed to quilt patterns. Again, putting in color, choosing scale, all of these things, patterns within a quilt are design choices, and they do make a quilt unique. But we are just talking about the overall pattern. So she says this book will delve into contemporary rug hooking, well, starting in the 19th century up until the mid 20th century, various stages of history, and she says until history begins to repeat itself. In other words, she'll go into all of those phases where the pendulum swings. And for example, rug hooking is very popular, and then it wanes. During the American Industrial Revolution, everybody's buying everything up. And then it has a renaissance, and then it will wane again during the years after the Great Depression. And then it will have a renaissance again. The pendulum just keeps swinging. And she covers all of that in this book. So all part of the overarching timeline. Accumulating appropriate historical photographs and illustrations has resulted in images that are not always up to today's standards, but a book of this type is forced to make use of what was available at the time. The important thing is to preserve the images and make them accessible to others through publication. That is like the mission statement of this book. I think that is really, really solid and also unnecessary, because the quality of this book, this is a Schiffer book, is phenomenal, right? I mean, not every photo can be in perfect focus of ancient things, ancient photos, but it's pretty close. I can't think of any examples where I think something looks really hard to see. She's done an amazing job compiling. This is a super academic work, my favorite kind. This is just a tremendous amount of work in this book. For the first time, she does a lot of firsts in this book too, which is really, really important. And she will in this book talk about sort of basic things that we keep coming back to as part of the core of rug hooking history. Stuff like the Kent books, right? Like the three officially first rug hooking books, although we know there are quite a few that were before that we've already looked at. But he comes to a lot of false conclusions in those three books, and they are carried, those false conclusions are carried through rug hooking books, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and only now are we finding other documentation information to support the fact that a lot of these conclusions were not true. She touches on things like that too. It's almost like reverse engineering what we know, but with more information. If you think about the history books that you had when you were in school, right? When I think about what the kids have now, it's very different, right? It's very different. The storytelling is very different. The tone, the slant, everything is very different. And there are some facts that have emerged over the decades since I've been in school that change things, and then the storytelling, I shouldn't call, teaching storytelling, but it really is. You're repeating a story, and you repeat it, the latest version of it, if possible, whatever that might be, and it is evolving as things emerge, documents, diaries, things like that. But if you think of it like that, it's really easy to say, it's true. A fact is not, a fact should be permanent and fixed, but it's not. It's still movable. Things can change that will shake up the whole base. So for the first time in this book, she will talk about the relationship between Frost and Ebenezer Ross and Alvin Gibbs. That's a name that we haven't said yet on Coffee Time, but certainly Ross and Frost we have talked about often. Their relationship, so having that connection and that history, we'll look at that in this book too, is a first. That's super exciting. she calls it a vital role in what became a tangled quadrangle. So interesting stuff she's going to bring up in the book. Um, she talks about the genesis, the five very, if not the most significant events in rug hooking, how they all happened in Maine. This is just Canadian people. Don't be upset. Of course, for Canadian people, we know that maybe and even probably rug hooking evolved in Canada, but five really significant events happened in Maine, and they are number one, the first published record of rug making as a craft appearing in print. So the first time that we can say it's a thing, right? During the Maine Mission series, I mentioned how Alice Peasley's grandmother never talked about the Walterborough sort of set of women, but they lived locally to that, and she was a local hooker, and she, hooked in bees and in settings with other women. She was certainly aware of Walterborough. She was certainly aware of a lot, but her grandmother had said things that really gave us the very first references to rug hooking. That's great. That's oral history. This is written history that we're talking about, something that's published. It's a little black and white sort of a pamphlet, just folded up papers, a unique publication. There's only one known so far. It says First Exhibition and Fair, Maine Charitable Mechanic Association. If you ever see this in an antique store, pick it up. It's worth a lot. In the city of Portland. And this document dates to September 24th, 1838. There was a fair running, there was an exhibit running in Portland that craftspeople were allowed to exhibit whatever they made, and get prizes, or at least awards and ribbons. And it ran September 24th to October 6th, and it's an invaluable list, this document, of the people who submitted stuff, right? Putting names and dates on things. And this belongs to the Maine Historical Society collection, so it's in the right place at this moment. That's also in Portland. So the first published mention of rug hooking, we'll come back to that. Number two is the development and the rise of fame of the Walterborough rug, which is a huge, huge big deal because it'll be the first sort of really different technique within rug hooking that we're seeing. We're not talking about shirred versus penny rug versus applique versus yarn or chenille. We're talking about, in rug hooking, there has already been an evolution, and it's the Walterborough rug. It's this very highly sculptured rug, very prized and very valuable, and as a skill, something that you would really strive to improve on, because it wasn't just plain old hooking. It wasn't something intuitive. It was something you really had to learn. So this is the first development within rug hooking, definitely in Maine. Edward Sands Frost was a resident of Biddeford, Maine. He would forever change the craft by introducing pre-stamped patterns and, of course, stencils. Frost's successor, who was James Strout, would initiate the search for and, in cooperation with Ebenezer Ross of Ohio, develop the punch needle. This is a big deal, too. There's constantly wars about the punch needle and who did it first. The punch needle is old, and when we're talking about punch, we're often talking about the shuttle that shifts back and forth, the two pieces, this guy that I've demonstrated before. For me, pretty hard to use. It works best horizontally. It's for me, it's very hard. It's very athletic to use, but people certainly used it. And there will be a lot of crossover once the punch needle is invented, like this little machine. People will still call it rug hooking, which creates a lot of confusion because you're not using a hook. But people who make rugs with a punch will still make things that are called hooked rugs. And again, more confusion, right? Then William Winthrop Kent, a Bangor native. Incidentally, Bangor is also where Stephen King lives. I don't know why I know that, but I do. Because I think the word Bangor, and I think, it's super scary, creepy times. We went through there. We went through there once when my dad was alive, years and years ago, when we were on vacation in Maine. And as he drove along, he said, Stephen King lives here. And I tried to read Salem's Lot, and it was just over the top. It was way over the top. But I had seen Carrie from like the doorway behind the couch where I wasn't supposed to see it, the one about the car, and Cujo, the one about the dog, and oh, so awful. I was just expecting to see Stephen King walking on the side of the road, and I still think about that because it was so suspenseful for the hours that we were driving on this one road. It was so suspenseful. We were probably nowhere near his house, but yeah, Bangor, Maine. Anyway, William Winthrop Kent, detour, a native of Bangor, despite some erroneous conclusions He exerted a major influence on rug hooking scholarship through his 3 books emphasizing history and the social importance of rugs, as well as their artistic significance. You can't take that away from him, right? You can't take that away from him. But yeah, some of the conclusions were wrong about the sort of origin, genesis of it, tools. It's hard to tell. For a layman, it's hard to tell. He was doing the best he could with the information he had at that time. So those are the 5 events, and those are 5 significant, right, huge events within rug hooking. A quick glance at the booklet, and she's talking about, we're talking about this booklet, this historical document from 1838 that's at the Maine Historical Society. She says a quick glance at the booklet immediately questions the separation of rugs made of yarn and rugs made of rags. So even as early as this, those 2 categories are separate. That's a really big deal, because whether the rag rugs are hooked or punched or whatever else, they are made from rags and strips and ripped up pieces, as opposed to yarn. Now, there will be more confusion because, of course, people could be hooking with yarn, and a lot of them are, and punching with yarn. But, of course, people are still sewing yarn, and I'll talk about that in sewing yarn rugs. I'll talk about that in a minute, too, because there is that huge separation. It's like a fork in the road, you know, hooking with a hook, sewing with a needle. That's where the 2 types of rug making will split, and they'll split as early as the 1830s. So she's talking about these early kinds of rugs. The one classification that we know for sure that people had always, even before this, even on a broader scale, is the separation between like a rag rug and a woven rug, right? Because a lot of women have looms, even small ones, and they're able to make rag rugs on a loom. There is very, very early on in rug hooking craft history in general, a separation between woven and, a handmade rag rug. A handmade rag rug is going to be made on your lap or on a homemade frame, and it is not going to be made on a loom. People don't tend to say non-loomed because it just, I guess it sounds confusing, but non-woven. This is a huge split. So she will talk about the different categories of early rugs that are not loomed rugs, that are not woven rugs. And she talks about the yarn sewn rug, which we've touched on before. I'll show you examples of this in a minute. But the yarn sewn rug is exactly what it sounds like. I know we've talked about this before, but it's worth hitting again. A needle was threaded with homespun wool, and yarn was sewn like a running stitch on the backing, right through the foundation, which was usually linen because it was usually homemade. We're not talking about sacking yet. And you're pulling up the stitch really snug on the reverse. So you are making a rug in a very similar way, but using a needle, so a completely different tool. You leave a loose loop on the surface, and that is what creates the pile. So that is a basic yarn rug, but one of the yarn rugs that can be very confusing and easily confused with a hooked rug is the category of rug that is a yarn sewn rug in a reed stitch. A reed stitch is when they have used a tool, for example, a reed, right, along like straw, sometimes a knitting needle, and they've actually held it on the backing and sewn around it. And then with that technique, you get very even loops, right? Easily confused later with, I don't think I could tell the difference between a reed rug, a yarn sewn reed rug, and a hooked rug. Because when once you introduce a tool, it's taking it one step up from sewing the rug. You introduce that tool and you've got uniform loops. And at that point, it's looking very good. It's looking really professional, high quality, nice high pile and a nice even pile. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. She says she believes that somebody called Leonard Burbank initiated the term reed stitch because it appears in Antiques magazine that we refer to all the time. 1922 issue, he uses that expression, and it seems to be the first reference, she says, to using that phrase reed stitch. So the author of that article did that. If you remember me saying in the 1920s, the editor of Antiques magazine had a particular passion for hooked rugs, like a collection. And that was like one of the things of his heart. And for that reason, in that period of Antiques magazine, there are a lot of articles on hooked rugs, just because he was biased, right? He loved them himself. So first reference to reed stitch in Antiques magazine. I thought that was interesting too. One of the other things that this pamphlet gives, such an old document, right? What does it mean? Who cares? It means so much, not just for the date. It tells us the names of the women who put the rugs into the show. And you know, I've touched on this before, but it's so it's so like emotional and dear and a little bit heartbreaking to think of women traveling to submit their rugs, their works of art. Most of them won't win. Most of them won't get honorable mention. It must have been such a thing to put yourself out like that. Such an early date to be doing this in 1838. It tells us the names of the women who tried. One of them is Mrs. Hatch, and she was from Kennebunk. She did 2 domestic rugs wrought without patterns, so they were original patterns. Many of the colors are specimens of domestic dyeing, so she must have supplied that info. They deserve the first attention, being very superior. And she got the best medal, which was the silver medal. That was the top. She won, in other words. Another lady called Miss Almina Stevens of Westbrook, she was only 15 years old. She made 1 hearth rug, and it was considered the second best. And the notes on that rug said that the colors were tastefully arranged and beautifully executed. And she got a diploma, so she must have gotten some kind of a document to say that she got the second best place. And incidentally, there will be a distinction between rugs based on, are they a hearth rug, are they like a welcome rug? Hearth rug is going to be the biggest category. Of course, a hearth rug is going to be wide and sort of narrow, not very tall, but very wide, because the hearths were huge and it would stretch right in front of the hearth. More on the hearth stuff another time, because she makes a great solid argument for hearth rugs not being used on a hearth, but we'll come to that tomorrow. So she just lists this brochure. She's transposing from the brochure that's at the Historical Society. Miss Sparrow of Portland also put in 1 rug, a good imitation of imported rugs. So she was probably looking at Eastern rugs of that time. We've talked about this too, the patterns of Eastern rugs that were coming from like the Mediterranean, from the Far East, all of the Oriental designs of the time. She made a copy, so she did something in the style of still an original pattern. And she also got a diploma. Miss Bonnard got a diploma for a Walterborough rug. So that's being mentioned in 1838. Particularly, she's from Walterborough and she makes a rug. We assume it's a Walterborough rug, not known. But Mrs. Belford of Portland, another handmade rug. And some of, she goes down this long list, just 1 rug. Miss Bradbury, 1 rug, 1 hearth rug, 3 hearth rugs. Sometimes there's a note that says excellent work, and sometimes there's nothing. They haven't said anything about the person's work. I hope that in person they said something about the person's work that made them feel really good and special. Now, this rug that I'm about to show you is the first rug. It was the rug of the Mrs. Hatch. Now, it's Mrs. Hatch, so I'm thinking it was more than 1 person. You know how sometimes within a family, if there's like a couple of spinster sisters or aunts or something, they are called the Mrs. something. So it's Mrs. Hatch, not Miss Hatch, and not Mrs., like abbreviated, like a wife. So I'm thinking it was made by more than 1 of the Hatches. The first rug ever awarded at first prize at the craft fair in the country was one of 2 yarn sewn rugs. So this is a yarn sewn rug, not a hooked rug, submitted by the Mrs. Hatch at the exhibition, 1838, Portland City Hall. It is a basket with a fruit design that shows a surprising artistic sophistication. A cluster of fruits anchors each corner, while the frame of flowers and fruit defines the frame. There is a yarn fringe that is frequently sort of seen on yarn rugs. Putting on a fringe was a big deal. It was a nice bit of bling. It was a really nice touch. There's a yarn fringe. The current whereabouts of this rug is unknown. The whereabouts are unknown. Circa 1838, again, presumed to be homespun yarn on a hand-woven linen base. This photo she took from the William Winthrop Kent book called Rare Hooked Rugs. And I'm going to show it to you. This must be the one photo that that Mildred's referring to as not being a top quality. Isn't it heartbreaking that this rug is missing? Because this is the first rug, handmade rug, that won an award in this country. Let me show it to you here. I hope you can see that. Now, there is a lot of sophistication here, right? She was just pointing out the clusters of fruit and flowers in the corners. the way that that anchors the corners so solidly, and then in the middle, very, very beautiful and domestic scene. Little vignette of flowers and fruits and things. The fancy yarn fringe, but you see that it does have a bit of an Asian feel, that sort of Oriental carpet, early Oriental carpet. It has that feel, right? It has that kind of color contrast. And they were dyeing. They were doing all the dyeing for it by themselves. This is just like what little darlings they were. Busy, busy, busy. I'm so happy that they were able to win the award. So maybe we should leave it there, because I wanted to go on and show you some examples of what the reed rug looks like, what the surface of it looks like, show you some examples of that, and also the caterpillar rug, and make more distinctions between these early rugs and hooked rugs. Because a lot of people send emails and things that say, I saw this rug at an antique store. I can't tell how old it is. Do you think it's a hooked rug, this kind of thing? It's so hard to tell. Just the one other style of rug that we just talked about, the sewn rug, the reed rug, it'd be real hard. It'd be, especially for an older rug that's been stepped on for years and the loops don't look the way they did when it was first made. It would be really hard. You would have to really study it. I'd put my number 4 glasses on and really study, particularly the back of it where the stitches came through. Of course, it looks a little bit different sewn on the back with having come through with a needle. But I think it's so interesting, and it's so much fun to make these distinctions, because we are just filling ourselves with information about early rugs and what they look like. And now you can take that with you. Now the weather is getting nice and life is returning to normal a little bit. You can take that with you when you go out to flea markets and antique stores, and think about when you see something, oh, it looks like this, but it might be this. It's just another feather in your cap, right? Super exciting. So I am going to leave it there this morning, and I will see you all tomorrow on Wednesday. Remember, we're doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for coffee times. I will see you tomorrow for coffee time, same place. Please like, comment, subscribe, anything that helps the channel, anything that helps our videos be visible to other people who are looking for information and fun. So have a great afternoon, and I will see you tomorrow.